McCarthy's Bar, a journey of discovery in Ireland. Written and read by Pete McCarthy, with special appearances by Kate Locke and Mike Grady. Side 1. The harp player had just fallen off the stage and cracked his head on an Italian tourist's pint. There was a big cheer, and Con the barman rang a bell on the counter. St Patrick's Day, and McCarthy's Bar was heaving. The 8th rule of travel states, never pass a bar that has your name on it. I'd chosen this McCarthy's to spend St Patrick's Day in, even though it was just a plain surname with no P in front of it. I'd invested £149 in a 3-day, 2-night St Patrick's Day package from Gatwick to be here, tempted back by hazy memories of my first visit, when I really had just spotted the sign, obeyed the rule, and walked in off the street. I'd been lured here this time by the dread of spending another St Patrick's night in the home counties of England. Each March the 17th brings to a head the inability of the English middle classes to deal with the Irish problem, in the sense that Ireland is a problem because it exists. This is when the radio phone-ins and letter columns of local newspapers are taken over by assorted flag fetishists and other embittered head cases. The gist of their bile is that, despite a glorious empire, 2 world wars, the Falklands, Margaret Thatcher, and a Queen Mother who has retained an impressive capacity for gin and dubonnet well into her 90s, the English refuse to celebrate St George's Day. So it's just not fair that we let all these paddies make such a fuss for the Irish saint, who was Welsh anyway. So, sometime in February, the worst of all months in England, when the desire to hibernate or flee is almost uncontrollable, and feelings of deepest malice towards Australians and their weather well up whenever the cricket's on the telly, the thought struck me. Why not get away this year for St Paddy's Day? Why spend a feast day, one that carries echoes of my earliest childhood memories, in an English pub, drinking overpriced Guinness and listening to Van Morrison's greatest hits, when, for just £149, according to the weekend papers, I could do exactly the same thing in an Irish pub, only in more convivial company. Well, it was a fine evening. At one point, the harp player fell off again, only backwards. And what a cosmopolitan crowd we were. As well as the Irish and the English, there were Americans, Italians, French and Scots, some sinister, well-heeled Russians, and even a couple of Hungarians, all agreeing loudly in half a dozen languages that the crack was indeed mighty. It must have been some time after 11 when I realised that, in a profound and very real way, Con the barman was my best friend, and quite probably a close relative. It was important he should know what I really felt. So I told him I didn't feel English, and that it's what you feel inside that really counts. To emphasise my sincerity, I knocked a drink over, and he asked me to leave. Outside, I stood under the green neon shamrock and looked up at the sign. McCarthy's, Hungary's top Irish pub. I turned up my collar. Budapest can still be quite chilly in March. Sod this, I thought. Next year, I'll go to Ireland. A year later, and I'm on the plane to Cork, in a cold sweat. The man across the aisle from me has a menacing aura and a dog collar. Something about him, the way he seems to threaten violence even while asleep perhaps, makes me suspect him of being a Christian brother. From the age of 10, I was taught by the Christian brothers, the carrot and stick method of education, but without the carrot. My first school report said, "Peter is an unpleasant and frivolous boy who will never make anything of himself, but he does take a punch well." We lived in the industrial northwest, in Warrington, where the air tasted of soap from the washing powder factory, so at least you knew it was clean. On St. Patrick's Day, you could spot all the kids from Irish families wearing huge bunches of shamrock on their blazers, in a proud display of cultural heritage that also made fights much easier to start. We'd been going to Ireland every year since I'd been born. West Cork, to be precise. Today it's a glamorous destination, a haven for upmarket tourists, English expats and Dutch cannabis importers. But in the 1950s and 1960s it was the arse end of the back of beyond, and that may be talking it up. We stayed at Butler's Gift, the small farm where my mother grew up. Until I was 15, I spent every summer of my life there. We made hay with pitchforks, went to market by horse and cart, and searched fuchsia hedgerows for leprechauns with a net and a jar. And although it's statistically impossible in a country as moist as Ireland, I'm sure the sun always shone. But these golden childhood memories have become a problem. For now, when I return to Ireland, I feel that I belong, whereas in England, my homeland, I feel detached, an outsider, an observer, in some way passing through. So what I'm wondering is this. Is it possible to have some kind of genetic memory of a place where you've never lived, but your ancestors have? Or am I just a sentimental fool, my judgment fuddled by nostalgia, Guinness, and the romance of the diaspora? Across the aisle, the Christian brother is still asleep. I'd wake him and ask his opinion. If experience hadn't taught me, the clergy can be lethal if riled in a confined space. As we cross the tarmac at Cork Airport and head for the terminal, we're greeted by someone dressed as St. Patrick. He has a sidekick who is wearing a rubber Celtic cross costume. They're lampooning the priests and the religion that held total sway in this country from the 7th century till about a week last Wednesday. I've come for the big parade tonight, but my taxi driver says it started at 2 o'clock, about an hour ago. He takes me to my hotel, which he tells me used to be the Hospital for Incurable Diseases. There's just time to calculate how many people must have died in my room over the years, about 4,000 I reckon, before hitting the streets. As I pass through the lobby, lots of overdressed families are sitting round eating salmon, while a priest plays the piano. I pretend this is normal and smile. The parade's already over, so there's nothing else for it but to observe the first rule of travel. On arrival, buy a local paper and go for a drink. The court cases, property prices and obituaries will tell you more than any guidebook, and the drink will help you feel you understand things that in reality are beyond your comprehension. I order a pint and a packet of plain crisps, which in Ireland are cheese and onion flavoured, and settle down with the paper. On the front page is a St. Patrick's Day photo of two languid Fijians unloading barrels of Guinness from a canoe onto a palm-fringed white sand beach. So, the global hype about all things Irish shows no sign of burning out yet. To be Irish today is to be welcome almost anywhere. The Irish are perceived as eloquent, romantic, tuneful, mystical and expert havers of a good time. And, as a bonus, in the same way that the English abroad are made doubly welcome once people realise they're not German, so the Irish are welcomed for not being English. West Cork is among the finest of Irish landscapes. Thanks to EC subsidy, the main roads are excellent. But as soon as you turn off into the hinterland, it's like going back in time, a maze of conflicting signposts and mileages with all the accuracy of a builder's estimate. But sometimes it's good just to get lost creatively. A sense of purpose occasionally has its place when travelling, but for the most part it's seriously overrated. I head north, up some lanes with grass growing up the middle of them, always a sure sign that you're going the wrong way, whatever you're trying to find. I soon reach a crossroads. A woman of about 60 is standing next to her near-mint condition Austin 1100, which she has parked inconspicuously in the middle of the road. Now, If you're going to go travelling in Ireland, it's important you know the correct way to ask for directions. What you don't do is abruptly say, "Excuse me, could you tell me the way to McCarthy's Bar?" This is an English technique, the subtext of which is, "I'm interrupting you here in a fairly clumsy way in order to elicit a necessary fact, but otherwise this transaction is of no value and will give no pleasure. Go on, tell me then." The preferred approach is to turn the encounter into a social occasion. A preamble is essential, something along the lines of, "Ah, that's a great hedge you're trimming," or, "Oh, it's a glorious day," especially if it isn't. Large quantities of personal information will then be exchanged, in the course of which the directions you're seeking may or may not emerge. The woman opens brilliantly.
"I'm just waiting for my daughter."
Of course. So that's why she's parked in the middle of a crossroads. She has a look that is at once both blank and intense, as if perhaps she spent too many years as a priest's housekeeper. We banter about crops and such like for a while, until I sense that the moment is right, and then, quick as a flash, I'm in. "I was wondering if you might be able to give me some directions."
"Ah, well, I'm afraid you see that I don't live around here."
"Oh, I see. Where do you live then?"
"Over there."
She points to a white farmhouse across some fields on a hillside about a mile away. I immediately implement Plan B, which in this instance is to drive at random until something happens. It's important to have a Plan B, especially when there's no Plan A. After a few minutes, I find myself at a T-junction I don't think I've passed before, though of course I can't be certain. And there's a pub. An Irish potato is a wonderful thing. Dry, fluffy, bursting with flavour, it bears no relation to its English cousin, which tastes in comparison as if it's been grown in a dark factory and overwatered with too much watered-down water. Yet, in England these days, we import vegetables from all over the world. Air-freighted for freshness, it says on the Mange Tout from Zimbabwe. Specially grown for flavour, claim the supermarket Dutch tomatoes. Well, what other reason is there for growing tomatoes? An ability to glow in the dark? But in the midst of the global foodie culture that has swamped England in recent years, no one has thought to import Irish potatoes, one of the most delicious and distinctive vegetables in the world and growing right on our doorstep. Bloody supermarkets, we get the tasteless rubbish we deserve. To my amazement, I'd said all this to the landlord within 10 minutes of walking into the pub at the crossroads. There were only 2 other customers. One of them looked up and said,
"Feckin' Dutch red peppers."
The pub was arranged as a traditional grocer's shop, with displays of tins, pyramids of cereal packets, rows of sweets, some tired oranges, and a large open sack of spuds that were giving off a tremendous, earthy smell that permeated the whole room. There were 2 beer taps and 4 spirits optics next to the combs and the hair slides. The barman cum shopkeeper was in his 60s and a cardigan. 2 of the 4 bar stools were occupied by a bearded, weather-beaten farm labourer and a clean-shaven, red-veined schoolteacher, both old enough to remember pounds, shillings and pence. They went quiet when I walked in, not in that, "Who's this stranger walked into the slaughtered lamb this cold, foggy night? Let's deny everything, then take him out the back, skin him and feed him to the badgers," sort of way, but simply to make room for me in the conversation. He half-poured my pint of Guinness, then let it stand for 3 minutes, in the time-honoured way. This lets the stout settle. It also allows the barman to ask you who you are, where you're from, and why you're here. The other customers listen and nod. Then he fills the pint, smooths off the head using a table knife with a parchment-coloured handle, and waits for you to take the first sip. Then the conversation continues. The EC and the £1 billion Ireland has had from them. Or is it 34 billion? Laughter all round. Then Sinead O'Connor, Riverdance, that Terry Wogan, Jerry Adams and Paisley, the Internet, Spanish trawlers, Clinton's sex addiction. but no music, no fruit machines, no TV, no food, and no till. And just the one interruption, from a woman coming in to buy tights and a cabbage. The perfect evening in the perfect pub. The kind of evening that leaves you with a warm feeling, especially when accompanied by 7 pints of Guinness. Before I left, I asked where he got his fragrant local potatoes from.
Egypt.
On the way back to the B&B, I fell over a wall. The next morning, I'm cruising the back lanes of West Cork, taking it easy on account of the hangover. I'm heading up a gentle hill when suddenly, round the corner at the top of the hill, a car appears. It's airborne like a rally contestant, near-side wheels in the middle of the road, the rest of the car entirely on my side. It swerves out of my path and thunders past, pinging a stone against the corner of my windscreen where it makes a tiny crack. I get a clear look at the driver, a slightly batty-looking 50-something lady who grins amiably and waves with one finger as she rockets past. I love that old-style Irish country habit of raising a finger off the steering wheel in acknowledgement, for all the world as if you're the only person they've driven past all week. At least, I think it's an acknowledgement. If it's, "Sit on this, you English fecker," then I have to say, it's done with great charm. 8 miles north of Skibbereen is Drimoleague, the village where my mother grew up. My earliest memories of travelling to Ireland are of the Glengarriff, which sailed from Liverpool Pierhead to Cork. There hadn't always been drive-on car ferries with reclining Pullman seats and discos and tax-free perfume. This was a cattle boat with berths for 30 or 40 passengers as a sideline. I remember my father taking me below decks to see the animals. They were in a sort of stable with straw, no nasty crates in those days. It all seemed perfectly natural. It was hard to tell whether the cows were going on their holidays or whether they'd already been and were on their way home. We'd leave from Pierhead at night, in what now seems like a scene from a period movie playing inside my head. Men in hats, fog, customs officers wielding pieces of chalk. The crossing would turn rough in the early hours of the morning as we rounded the southeast corner of Ireland and the swell of the Atlantic hit the Irish Sea. The seasickness was spectacular. Today's ferries may be sleek and comfortable, but they deny young people the unforgettable experience of witnessing at first hand a cow throwing up. I suppose we can't stand in the way of progress, but holiday travel's a duller business without bovine projectile vomit. Arriving in Drimoleague, I visit my grandfather's grave outside the rather incongruous modern church. A man is tidying up a grave nearby, his car parked next to him with the doors open. I'd been hoping for a spot of transcendental graveside ancestral contact, perhaps a piercing insight into why I should feel I belong out here. Instead, his car radio's blaring out a phone-in about cat flaps. For old time's sake, I go inside the church for a bit of a mooch. And almost straight away, there on the notice board, I see it, half A4 size, held up by 2 old-fashioned drawing pins. A notice. St. Patrick's Purgatory, Loch Derg, unique centre of Celtic spirituality, 3-day pilgrimage, must be at least 15, good health, able to walk and kneel unaided. Please fast from midnight prior to arrival. £20 includes boat fare and accommodation. Then, in small print at the bottom, also 1-day retreats which do not require fasting or walking barefooted. Fasting? Walking barefooted? This could be just the job. A high-octane blend of fundamentalist flagellation and Celtic New Age whimsy with no food. If anything can give me an insight into my sense of metaphysical Irishness, this might be it. I jot down the phone number and head for the phone box in the village. After 20, or perhaps even 25 rings, the phone is answered by someone who sounds like a priest with grazed knees. I ask him how much barefoot work is involved and whether it's very rocky out there.
Now don't you worry about that. We have ladies of 70 and young boys of 15, but the retreats don't begin until the 1st of June.
As he puts the phone down, I fancy I hear his scar tissue creak. It seems my sadomasochistic epiphany will have to wait a while. I know the 8-mile stretch of road between Drimoleague and Dunmanway pretty well. Like many West Cork towns, Dunmanway was developed in the 17th century as a plantation or settlement by the English. In recent years, the town has once again been settled, not by the well-heeled yachties you find in nearby Kinsale, but by alleged crusties, hippies, druggies, pagans and New Age travellers. I wonder how they come to be here. Were they hounded out of England by the police? Or is it just easier to get the dole in Ireland, as Bridie, the Irish mother of a friend of mine back in England, insists?
Peter, the lanes are full of them. Dirty, filthy creatures, living like tinkers, growing drugs. Sure, the country's been ruined by the English, going over there to collect the dole and get drunk.
She seemed unaware that this was what the English had been saying about her and the rest of the immigrant Irish for the last 50 years. I check into a small hotel and bar on the edge of town, variously described as family-run, 2-star and, more worryingly, Class B. My room has a small TV, mounted on a metal bracket so far up the wall you'd have to sit on the wardrobe to watch it. Tea and coffee-making facilities, including those tiny sachets of UHT milk that have done so much to make the world a happier place, are here as advertised. And there's an unobstructed view of the roof of the disco. I wolf the complimentary custard creams, one of which is broken, and hit the street. I've decided to go and visit the dole-scrounging, pot-growing, soap-dodging, poutine-guzzling New Agers in their caravans on the wild side of town. 2 hours later, I'm in Dominic's house. The place is like a junk shop that's been ransacked by burglars who were interrupted before they could take anything away. I know it looks a mess, grins Dominic, opening 2 cans of Murphy's and producing a packet of cigarette papers from underneath a cat, but I know where everything is. To someone from a carefully preserved English cottage or a freshly carpeted Irish bungalow, it might look like hippie squalor. But it could suggest something else. The intricate jumble of life's essentials, tools and fuel, children and animals, music and alcohol, all crammed together with not quite enough money to go round, is like a recreation of a rural Irish way of life that has all but disappeared. And, in a country that's traditionally exported its young men to work in the English building trade, he's a builder from England. Around 7 o'clock, we bump-start a car that has an unusual open-plan area where the passenger seat used to be, and head for a party that's scheduled to run until Sunday night. It's Friday. Next morning, the hotel reception desk is staffed by 2 pallid, grey, plump young women who've had no recent exposure to daylight or unfried food. One of them guides me to a small dining room with a mock classical archway, but no windows. Every place setting is festooned with the debris of previous breakfasts: congealed bacon fat, rigid egg yolk, cold toast, curdled tea, evil Weetabix that sucked up all the milk. The carpet's sticky grip hints at rare agricultural diseases. The waitress gets stuck into the nearest table, using an impressive forearm as bulldozer. I catch a nightmare glimpse of cold black pudding and tea dregs sluicing into a half-eaten bowl of muesli that's already begun to set, and avert my gaze. She brushes some recalcitrant crumbs to the floor with a hand on which an elastoplast is well overdue for renewal.
Careful now, the plate's hot.
Then she puts it down on my hand. 2 rock-hard fried eggs stare up, rigid and unforgiving as tiny silicone breasts. They're turning purple from the heat of the plate and threatening to explode at any moment. An overtly hostile sausage and bacon raw as Parma ham complete the spread. I pick up the stainless steel teapot and pour tea into the cup and onto the tablecloth. The tea in the cup turns a dark shade of khaki. Hang on, though. I haven't put any milk in. There must have been something milky in it already. Oh, dear God, no. She's given me a cup of someone else's dregs. If you're ever in the area, prices start at £28, which includes a full-cooked breakfast. I saw a sign for a hostel yesterday, a couple of miles out of town, so I've decided to give it a try. I've always been prejudiced against hostels, presuming they'd either be full of buck-toothed ramblers with well-polished apples and creases in their socks, or groovy young backpackers swapping addresses, drugs and girlfriends, either of which would be far too depressing. It turns out there are only two other guests. One is a pear-shaped Englishman who looks, and I know one really shouldn't generalise about these things, like a paedophile on the run. The other is a dark-haired German cyclist with an ill-considered toothbrush moustache. I admire the magnificent view and pick my room, a converted gypsy caravan in the grounds for £10 a night. I sit in the caravan for a bit, because there isn't room to do anything else, then set off to find Dominic. Though a tad hoarse, he's in good shape for a man who stayed up till dawn, then slept on some rubble. So we pop in for a pint by way of a loosener, then set off for Wild Mountain. It was called that long before the travellers started turning up in the 80s. I suppose I was expecting some sort of commune, but what they've built is a village. Families, couples and singles, with their own plots of land, sharing aspirations but living their own lives. But there's no shantytown squalor or industrial-sized marijuana plantations guarded by junkies with machetes. If you were a vindictive small-town moralist looking for something to deplore, you'd be struggling. But then the sight of an overgrown and decaying cement farmhouse would give some grounds for optimism. We park in the lane and walk through the gap where the gate used to be, into a jungle of giant fuchsia and super nettles. No weed has been cut, no half-hearted paintbrush wielded for 20 years or more. The back of the house, facing south, is in brilliant sunshine. Two ginger cats are asleep among the cans. Sitting in the doorway on a wooden chair, staring at the floor, is a man of about 50. Wellies, worn over trousers that might have been a different colour when they started out, suggest an authentic bachelor. There's a powerful stench, as if something's died in his house, or trousers. Dominic tells me that this is Stephen, the landlord of Wild Mountain. He'd once owned much of the mountain and the land around it. 15 years ago, he began renting plots to the new English arrivals. Then, to raise cash, he started selling the land. And so it's gone on, hand to mouth, to off-licence, to mouth again, renting and selling to keep himself afloat. The family farm has been sacrificed to the bottle. He takes me by the arm.
I'll tell you something now, boy. If it's true what they say about whiskey, that it's bad for you, then I'd have been dead years ago.
I'm moved by his pitiful situation. As we leave, he's staring out towards the ruined McCarthy Castle in the valley, the spectacular view completely obscured by 6-foot nettles.
Come again, boys. It's nice to have the company.
Later, back in my caravan, I read a history of Dunmanway I found on a shelf in the hostel and realise that, in a sense, history is repeating itself. The original English immigrants were rapidly absorbed. This new generation have settled land left empty by famine and emigration. They've made life as a separate community. But crucially, their children see themselves as Irish, and within a generation or two, their English antecedents will have melted away. Tourists will be taken up the mountain to see the strange old houses where the English hippies used to live, but where everyone's Irish now. As I turn out the light, an eerie screech cuts through the night. a fox or bird perhaps, or one of my fellow hostelers, crying out in ecstasy. I get up to fasten the lock on the caravan door, but there isn't one. The next lunchtime, I head over to the 3-day party to say goodbye. There's a campfire smouldering and a handful of people are sitting round, sipping hot drinks and looking partied out. One man is asleep or dead on a cart. A 12-year-old is teaching a 7-year-old to fire juggle. It seems to be going quite well. Neither of them is on fire yet, at any rate. Dominic is standing at the top of the lane as I drive off. With his weathered, lived-in face, his thick tweed jacket, rough pants, big boots and flat cap, he doesn't look like part of some English subculture anymore, but like what he's become. An old-style countryman, doing his best to raise a family, make ends meet and have a good time on a wild patch of Irish ground. Side 2. The convent sits on a hillside on the edge of the village, looking down on a ruined abbey and a spectacular tidal inlet of the Atlantic Ocean. It has 12 acres of grounds, a walled 19th century vegetable garden and a restaurant with stained glass windows that was once a chapel. The building and grounds, once the home of the Sisters of Mercy, the nuns, not the prostitutes in the Leonard Cohen song, were bought at a knockdown price from a disillusioned Californian mind control cult who just couldn't seem to control minds out here the way they did back home. And now it's a guest house with a great restaurant. If you're the kind of person who enjoys gourmet cuisine in a deconsecrated chapel, then you'll struggle to find better at the price. But it isn't actually called the convent, and I'm not going to tell you where it is. The third rule of travel says, never bang on about how wonderful some unspoiled place is, because next time you go there, you won't be able to get in. I've decided to do what you're allowed to do with a clear conscience in Ireland, Spain and other countries not founded on the Protestant work ethic, and go to bed for the day. However, as I'm half English by birth and wholly so by environment, it's impossible to sleep. Mind you, the electric saw in the room below doesn't help, shrieking and grinding away in what later turns out to have been an ecologically disastrous and ultimately doomed attempt to create a cold storage room by sawing a fridge in half. One of the seductive things about West Cork is that stuff is done in an altogether less by-the-book way than it is in, say, Guildford. So by lunchtime I'm sitting in a pub just down the road in the village. It has a distinct flavour of the 50s, that long-lost era before Guinness was chilled, when cows were milked by hand, when a priest could still fumble beneath an altar boy's cassock without fear of being pictured in the local paper getting out of a meat wagon with a blanket over his head. A young builder with a scar on his face is sitting at the bar eating a very rare steak with garlic butter. As I make my order, he deftly initiates a conversation and, in less than a minute, has confided that, although he's never actually worked on Jeremy Irons's castle up the road, he once sold him some timbers, over the odds like, in the boatyard at Baltimore.
So what are you doing here anyway? On holiday, are you? Or are you looking for a nice cheap old house to buy? Because if that's your game, you should have been here 10 years ago. Them days are gone now.
I say I'm visiting my family and travelling around.
What? Looking for your roots, are you? Like all them poor feckin' Yanks in Killarney. Jesus Christ, the trousers on some of them fellas. Do you know what? Best feckin' thing about this country, the rain. You know why? 'Cause if the sun was always feckin' shiny, every bastard would be coming here.
I wake the next morning with sun streaming through the windows and realise almost immediately it must be morning. The landscape looks luminous and a glorious day is beckoning. So I go back to bed for an hour, then get up again. Out on the landing, at the top of a grand staircase with a huge Gothic ecclesiastical window, is an American couple. "Hey, we've been up for hours," says their body language. "We've already had a light breakfast of wholemeal toast and herb tea. We've explored the grounds, and now we're going on a walk that will help turn us into better people. You look like shit, by the way." Then they actually say,
"Beautiful day."
Yeah, it sure is. Over breakfast, browsing through my copy of 100 Best B&Bs run by mad nosy religious fanatics, I hatch a plan. I will definitely leave Cork today. I've no idea why, I just need a plan, and this is it. I'll head north to County Kerry. 8 miles on, there's a fork in the road. Right for Killarney, Kerry and the north, left for Bantry Bay and the Beara Peninsula. On an impulse, I turn left. After all, there's no point in being too rigidly Anglo-Saxon about these things. The road west goes through Skibbereen. On the western edge of town, it runs alongside a river for a little way. I pull over and get out to admire the view. Immediately across the road is a ruined abbey and cemetery. The sign says this is Abbey Strowney, the monastery of the stream, ruined since the 13th century. There's a white, painted wrought iron monument, all ornate flowers and petals, incorporating a harp and a Celtic cross. Monument erected 1887, it says, to memory of famine victims, made by Eugene McCarthy, blacksmith of Island Street, Skibbereen. It's a famine pit, an unmarked grave of victims of the potato famine. I find an inscription on stones nearby. To the nameless dead who lie here and in wayside graves. There isn't a soul to be seen, no cars passing. The undulations in the ground suddenly look like long human shapes, as if it's too full and they're rising to the surface. How many must be buried here? Dozens? Hundreds, maybe. Ireland's worst single disaster, 1845 to 1850. 1 million dead, 1 million emigrated, says the stone. Skibbereen, epicentre of this horror, suffered more than most. Here, in the famine burial pits, were placed the coffinless remains of 9,000 victims. 9,000. I cross the road back to the car and take a look in a book I've been reading. The Trouble with the Irish, or the English depending on your point of view, by J.P. Wibberley. It was written in the 50s, and I picked it up in a second-hand shop in a fishing village in Nova Scotia. Anyway, according to Wibberley, Parliament in London voted £100,000 to Irish famine relief. In the same year it gave £200,000 to the beautification of Battersea Park. Anyone who knows Battersea Park, he observes, will quickly admit that such a sum was totally inadequate for the purpose. The road west has the massive expanse of Bantry Bay to the left and stark mountains of biblical ruggedness to the right. Sheep are attached to unlikely precipices as if by Velcro. In the port of Castletown Bear, there's a B&B sign on a big old house. So, on impulse, I'm getting the hang of this, I go and knock on the door. After the sort of pause that usually suggests someone inside is destroying evidence, the door is opened by a bespectacled, guilty-looking man who hasn't recently showered. He squints malevolently round the door and says,
Yeah?
Do you have a room for the night?
On your own, are you?
I am, yeah.
I only have a double.
Oh, that's okay. I'll pay the double rate.
No.
Why not?
I don't usually do that.
He goes to shut the door to stop me seeing whatever is hanging from a meat hook or decomposing in the acid bath behind him. But suddenly we're interrupted by two returning guests, a good-looking, fresh-faced couple in their 20s, Dutch cyclists, I'd say, at a guess, who go in past him, smiling. As the door slowly closes, my last glimpse is of him watching them go up the stairs, with the brooding gaze of a serial killer of Dutch cyclists. Half an hour later, I'm unpacking in a hygienic bungalow on the edge of town. As I close the gilt-embossed door of the white melamine wardrobe and sit down on the polyester and fiberglass duvet cover, I can gaze out through the double-glazed UPVC windows at the untamed mountainside beyond. I'm not the first to observe that the landscape of rural Ireland has been badly defaced these last 30 years by the slapdash construction of suburban housing in places where there are no suburbs. But before sneering at Irish bad taste, smug outsiders who live in twee English villages, like me, should bear in mind that the invasion of the killer bungalows is simply the logical outcome of Ireland's history of poverty, a poverty for which English landlords must shoulder their fair share of the blame. Ireland doesn't possess the picturesque old housing stock that's to be found in England and France, because this used to be a desperately poor country, and those houses were never built. The self-confident consumerism of the new houses is a response to this history of deprivation. Look, the bungalows are saying, we used to be that, but now we're this. It's a very Irish paradox that modern houses can speak so eloquently of the nation's past. When I arrived here, Mrs. O'Sullivan greeted me in textbook style.
Where are you from? Are you working or on holiday? Are you married? Do you have children? Why aren't they with you? What work is it you do clearing off and leaving them behind? Will you be wanting mass times? 8:30 all right for breakfast? Will you be in late? I'll make some sandwiches so.
Then she let me in, before setting off with her husband and 2 kids in a people carrier with a fish symbol on the back for 6:30 Mass, the Saturday night service now fulfilling the once inflexible Sunday obligation.
Crazy, really. But isn't it grand for the supermarkets and the golf clubs?
The first rule of travel in Ireland states, the more bright primary colours and ancient Celtic symbols outside the pub, the more phony the interior. Reassuringly, the sign outside McCarthy's Bar is plain white lettering on black. Inside, it's an effortless compromise. The front half is a grocer's shop with seats for drinkers, the back half a bar with groceries. Even at 7 o'clock in the evening, damp, friendless and without a plan, I can sense this place might be a contender in the Best Pub in the World competition I've been conducting since 1975. For the Ovalau Club in Fiji, the pressure is suddenly on, especially when it turns out to be the landlady's birthday. It must have been around 4 in the morning that I spilled the whiskey on the social worker. 5:30 as I walked up the gravel drive to the front door of the B&B. As I lurched inside, Mrs. O'Sullivan appeared, just in time to see me pause to admire the glow-in-the-dark Virgin Mary holy water font with integral nightlight and thermometer, and knock it off the wall. Politely declining the 6 rounds of ham sandwiches on the tray she was holding, I edged gingerly along the corridor to the wrong bedroom door and opened it. If it weren't for the fact that the pubs had been closed for 6.5 hours, she'd probably have thought I was pissed. Killarney, looking good, says the sign, as you're greeted by rows and rows of B&Bs. Many are suburban semis and terraces, small family homes that, TARDIS-like, have miraculously created the space to accommodate big-boned American families reared on hormone-enriched all-you-can-eat buffets. All the houses are decked out with signs proclaiming their attractions. "All rooms en suite," they shout. "TV! car space, coffee-making facilities. But why stop there? Tourism's a cutthroat business. You need to get all your selling points up there on the board. Sheets on all beds, legs to keep bed off floor, drawer to put underpants in, walls. I'm beginning to realise that the parts of the country I've been in so far have been deserted because every bugger's here. Outside the big hotels, pony and trap drivers with the faces of medieval assassins are touting for business among gaggles of befuddled recent arrivals who are wandering round in a collective trance like Stepford tourists. "Will the horse expect extra oats?" inquires an admirably self-aware American who, at a guess, has won a trip to Europe as first prize in the fattest arse in the Midwest competition. Perched on top of the cart in baseball cap, stripy stretch fabric polo shirt and vast architect-designed shorts, he looks like Tweedledum. It takes two of the assassins to hoist his wife up there to join him, like Tweedledee in drag. The horse craps ostentatiously in derision, and off they trundle, to provide a bit of comic relief for the people stuck in the traffic jams. To show they've been assimilated into Celtic society, they've both been draped in tartan picnic rugs. He's smoking a large cigar, while she's opted for a bag of fudge as big as Dobbin's nose bag, to tide her over till dinner in half an hour's time. Irish hotels catering for Americans realise they need to serve American-sized portions. So soon she'll be tucking away a whole spit-roast pig with all the trimmings, followed by a main course, all washed down with quarts of Diet Coke to stop her from getting fat. Next morning, at 10 o'clock, people are struggling along the streets with their luggage, desperate to leave before the next lot arrive. Even the people without luggage don't seem to live here. They're all rifling through guidebooks, pausing tentatively on street corners and looking up at buildings, behaviour which in many other countries means, "I'm not from here, so please rob me." Outside the hotels, the assassins are touting among the traffic, while their ponies fantasise about life in a field. By now, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, still on target for 12 countries in 10 days, will be somewhere on the Grand Canal, in a gondola that's rapidly shipping water. The radio's turned up loud as I sit in the traffic trying to get out of the centre of Killarney.
Hello there, Donegal. Thanks for phoning in, and how are you today?
Well, I'm on dialysis, so not too good, really.
Right. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Donegal. Now, what was it you were wanting to talk about anyway?
Colour gas!
Of course you were.
If aliens landed, you'd be hard-pressed to explain to them the difference between Killarney traffic and parking. You're dealing in very fine nuances here. I suppose that traffic implies, at least on some subliminal level, the intention of moving. But on mornings like this, it's a purely academic distinction, because whether you're sitting in it or not, the car is going nowhere.
So, what you're saying, Donald, is that you can't lift the gas cylinders because of the dialysis.
That's right. And my brother now, he used to lift them for me, but he can't anymore because of the triple bypass, do you see?
I do see, Donald. Of course I do.
The presenter's doing his best to sound concerned, but clearly this isn't what he went into showbiz for. His polished mid-Atlantic brogue can't conceal the fact that he'd like Donald's cottage to collapse on him, his phone and his kidney machine. He obviously hasn't considered the possibility that Donald may not exist. Students on media studies courses are encouraged to write or phone in to see how programme makers react under extreme provocation. So it could be that Donald isn't on dialysis in a turf-fired hovel in Monaghan, as he claims, but on vodka and night nurse in a centrally heated flat in Dublin, killing time until countdown comes on. Halfway to Tralee, I stop to buy a small bottle of still mineral water. It's fresh spring water, just like we used to get from my uncle's well when I was a kid, except that it costs £2.40 a litre now. Mind you, you couldn't read a list of ingredients on the side of the bottle in those days, so that's value for money. Looking back, It's hard to imagine how we coped before we could read the contents of a bottle of water. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, nitrate and fluorides, but not a trace of fat. That's one of the best things about water, I reckon. No fat. Astonishingly, it's been imported from Canada. Corruption on a massive scale must be involved if someone is flying bottles of water from Canada to the wettest country in the world and still making a profit. The centre of Tralee is from a children's storybook, a town free of glass and steel modernising and bearing no resemblance to the increasingly homogeneous English high street with its depressingly familiar procession of brand names. It puts you in touch with a remembered but recently disappeared past and makes you realise how long it is since you walked through an English town and thought, oh good, there's a branch of Dixon's. There are a couple of traditional-looking but unponced-up hotels with Georgian doors and sash windows. Over a comfort food set lunch, I'm distracted by the conversation at the next table, where two big, rugged men in suits are beginning to reap the benefits of the couple of drinks they had before lunch.
Hey, did you hear about the Cork man who went on Mastermind?
Kerry men like them have always made jokes about Cork men and vice versa. The rest of Ireland makes jokes about Cork and Kerry, while the English make jokes about the whole of Ireland, in the belief that there's nothing funny about Surrey.
So Pat goes on Mastermind. He goes and sits in the chair in the spotlight, and they announce his special subject. Ireland, the Easter Rising and the War of Independence 1916 to 1921. Start the clock, says your man. First question. Name one of the leaders of the Easter Rising of 1916. Pass. Name the IRA leader who led the fight against the British before agreeing to partition. Pass. Name the first president of the Irish Free State. Pass. And a voice shouts out from the audience, "Come on, Pat! Tell the bastards feck all!"
It has to be said, by the way, that the vivid use of language that has put the Irish right up there among the greats of English-speaking literature has also made them world-class swearers. And of course, the Australians, as well as being brilliant and colourful users of the language, are also top-notch swearers. And I imagine that's all down to the Irish. A large percentage of the first convict settlement of Australia consisted of Irish petty criminals. Forced labour in unnaturally hot sunshine must have rapidly expanded the average Irishman's vocabulary of profanities beyond its natural limit, with the result that today the Australian sportsmen descended from them are able to defeat English teams simply by swearing at them. The latest plan is to follow the road via Galway to Donegal, but I look at the map and something catches my eye. The Dingle Peninsula. But it lies to the south and west, and I want to be going north. Whichever way you look at it, that's the wrong way. And also, the more diversions I make, the longer it'll be before I get to the barefoot fasting and inflicting of holy bruises at Loch Derg. A couple of hours later, I'm in Dingle, the most westerly town in Europe. Out here, there are just a handful of tiny villages, the Blasket Islands, and then America. It's clear that things have changed since I was last here. The town itself, a few streets of traditional houses, shops and pubs clustered round a lovely harbour, still looks the dream Irish town that visitors hope to discover, and, increasingly, more and more of them do just that. It seems to be on the cusp of a change, midway between its former status as a remote fishing port and its future destiny as a shishi Celtic holiday resort. There's a plethora of places to satisfy all your candle, crystal and druidic jewellery requirements, and plenty of leprecornalia, shamrockovia and other assorted paddywhackery. There's a restaurant with an illuminated sign proclaiming Celtic food. I'm intrigued by the prospect of authentic recipes resurrected from the twilight of our Celtic past. A waitress brings me a menu. There's pâté and toast, pasta of the day, fish and chips, and cottage pie. Perhaps these dishes once had some ritual or ceremonial significance that's been lost with the passage of time. We know the Celtic tribes originally came from Central Europe. I suppose it's possible they brought cottage pie with them. Those lines drawn in the mashed potato with a fork could be based on a pre-Christian pagan design. Dingle is the only place I know with a bicycle shop that's also a pub. I take a seat at the tiny bar next to two conspicuously veined old kerrymen. One of them asks me how I'm enjoying my holiday, and I say the town's changed since I was last here. He takes a sip of his whiskey.
Sure it has. I blame that feckin' dolphin.
Sometime in 1984, a young dolphin began to appear in Dingle Harbour. He was christened Fungi, and it wasn't long before a raft of fungi-related industries grew up around him, boat trips and swimming sessions and photos and B&Bs. And suddenly, Dingle was no longer remote. When you think about it, it's remarkable how reliable Fungi has been, turning up on cue every day for 15 years. For a wild dolphin, this is exceptional behaviour. I can't banish the lingering suspicion that the bottom might fall out of the tourist boom if the guy who dresses up in the dolphin suit every day decides he's too knackered to do it anymore. I suppose it's only a matter of time before towns in the tourism business start realising that literature, like cinema, has huge marketing potential and start offering inducements to authors to use them as a setting. Harry Potter and the Dolphin of Dingle. Hannibal Lecter, Silence of the Dolphins. Angela's Dolphin. That'd pull the crowds in. The short journey along the coast from Dingle to Slea Head and Dunquin is the most affecting landscape I have ever seen in my life. Tiny enclosed fields run down dramatic mountainsides and are farmed to the cliff's edge before giving way to a dazzlingly multi-hued Atlantic. Hedges are scarlet with fuchsia. Just above the road are the Beehive Huts, stone shelters occupied by monks and hermits in the early days of Christianity. As the sun disappears briefly behind cloud, then reappears, there's a dazzling display of light on water. Great Blasket Island seems to come in and out of focus, surrounded by glittering halos. Way off to the south, the Skelligs are shimmering on the horizon like an illusion. I take a walk on the cliff top and go past an old cottage. The door is open, and through it on the wall I can see a picture of the Sacred Heart. On a bench outside, in wellies and cap, clutching a walking stick, is the old boy who's probably lived there all his life. 20 yards away, outside the next cottage, a couple are unloading suitcases and wine from a car with French number plates. The next time I'm here, the old man will be gone, and there'll be another cottage to rent. I'm back in Dingle, eating squid in a pub, when the couple at the next table strike up a conversation. Darren and Mandy are about 30, very English, very Essex, very Ilford, and very friendly. It's their first time in Ireland, and they didn't know you needed Irish money. "Well, I can't see the point. It's all British, really, innit?" says Darren. "Here, there's no trouble round this bit, is there? No mad paddies with bombs. What are they all fighting about in Belfast, anyway?" I'm faced with the alarming prospect of discussing the troubles in a public place in Ireland with a loud, ignorant Cockney. I decide to divert his attention by telling him a true story. I once had to stay at a hotel in Kensington and get up at 6 in the morning to go to work. I had the lift to myself until it stopped at the 4th floor, the doors opened, and the Reverend Ian Paisley got in. Nothing in life had prepared me for such a surreal moment. I stood there with my jaw hanging open like a loon, toothpaste caked in the corner of my mouth. To be fair to Paisley, he did nod and give a tight smile in acknowledgement. I couldn't bring myself to say, good morning, though, in case he disagreed and shouted, "No!" in such a confined space. So I tell this to Darren, who looks thoughtful for a moment, then says, "Paisley, is he with the IRA, or is he one of them other nutters?" The musician is singing "Ruby, Don't Take Your Love to Town." Darren and Mand are joining in the chorus, and it's my round. It's shaping up to be a long night.